Welcome, my friends, to episode 23. The couple, Gus and Belle, were at the village of the natives, where Belle had received some attention for a head wound, you remember? And they were now being treated to a bit of social activity. Said, Belle was not sure about this whole occult idea that seemed to be growing in popularity among the young at home, and it scared her. However, what she could note for herself was that here in the deep, warm and wild forest village was that these men had now transformed themselves into strange creatures, moaning, waving their arms about and their heads, arguing with empty space, and two of them gazing into the air with as much concentration as a teenager watching a good film, all as a result of taking a drug that's used locally there. The women continued to dance. Taliki was a graceful creature and danced not to a gentle rhythm, and seemed to be pacing her steps after the fashion of an animal. Belle wondered if Taliki would feel so fascinated by a dance she had attended with Duncan a few months ago at the Stonehenge Inn near Amesbury and on Salisbury Plain. Would Taliki think that the drunken men and the mini-skirted girls were as alien as all this seemed to her? Some of the men just went from hallucinations to trance to sleep where they were. Others eventually rounded up their families and either left for their hut or else retreated to their own area of the communal home. Some just slept on the floor with a blanket, but most returned to hammocks. Yukta and Taliki guided them to an area near the old healer, and they were shown a hammock each. When Belle put her head back in the hammock, her eyes were still full of the noise that had now long died, and her eyes could still see all the movement in the room, the flashes of reds, yellows, blues, and the whites of the eyes on the dark faces. Her nostrils were still feeding on the smell of spices, strange dishes, human perspiration, and the heady smell of strange substances used to take human brains from reality to delusions and hallucinations. She was tired and excited, confused and yet happy. Who was she to be privileged to receive hospitality from these people when maybe no other Europeans had ever ventured into their village before? As she lay there, her ears gradually turning away from the sounds that had ceased to those that were left, she was amused by the high-pitched wheeze of the old man snoring and the deep bass tone of Gus's. Even in slumber, she thought, harmony can exist if peace prevails. Her thoughts wove together in a pattern for reality to strange dreams. She dreamt of her and Duncan dancing at the Stonehenge Inn, but the band were men from the village and Gus was beating time with the healer's knife, and somewhere a parrot was squawking. In the morning when she awoke, all the village around her was active. Women were cleaning up, children were playing games outside noisily. Gus was already up, sitting cross-legged at the fire with the old healer that everyone respected so much. The two of them were eating a bowl of some mushy stuff, quite yellow in colour, and seemed to be sharing a joke which pleased Belle. She had thought Gus was about her things last night, but here he was, sharing food and laughter with the village elder. Most of the men seemed to be outside the home now, and Belle wondered how they spent their days. Were they all hunters? Leaving a more than comfortable hammock, she stepped to the ground, and the old man called out, "Gayat, Belle." She replied, "Gayat," and bowed her head a little as she had seen Taliki do in a mark of respect. He motioned with his hand, and Belle moved forward and joined the happy Gus. "Gayat," he said. The old healer called out in about half a minute, and Taliki arrived with the bowl of the yellow mush. In the bowl was a crudely shaped spoon, but the bowl itself was a beautiful object. Round the sides was a faint grey pattern covering the brown of the pot in a lace-like pattern, and over this was an image of a bird, some kind of bird. The colours of the bird were very bright, blues and greens mostly. Belle would have liked to know if this bird existed, or did it only exist in the minds of the men who had been inhaling the apple. Whatever the yellow mush was, it had a sweet taste, was very pleasant, and left a slightly hot flavour in the mouth, almost like a spearmint flavour. How much Belle would have liked to ask Taliki for the village recipe book, but the language barrier would allow for no exchange in this way. She had to satisfy herself with just enjoying it and maybe never knowing what it actually was. Gayat Belle. She turned around, and the young man Rugno, grandson of the doctor, was standing behind her. He had a huge grin and sat down beside her. In his hand he had the photographs that had been taken on the original visit of the tribesmen to Gus and Belle, those taken with a polarised instant camera. He handed them to Belle as she finished her yellow mush, and she examined them. There were 5 that had been taken at the time of the visit, and there were some that had been taken back in the village. Also one taken on the way back in a canoe of men in a second canoe. Bell examined them. They brought back all the apprehensions the first time the locals had visited the camp. She could see the anxiety in both her face and Gussie's face, but all their fears had been groundless. These friendly people had become good neighbours. As Belle looked at the picture, she remembered that there had been another one of just her and Gus, but it was missing. Belle wondered who had it. Maybe it had been put up in some place much like people back home. She remembered her mother's pride in her family photos, all on the mantelpiece, and her dead father in pride of place. Belle now found that she was in the same situation as Gus had been. Her and Rugno looked at the pictures together and shared laughter. After a while, Rugno indicated to her and Gus to come outside. The old medium man smiled approvingly, and they followed Rugno. Soon the little toddler girl, Lickler, and the small boy, together with some other children, were gathered round them, and some of the women, Rugno said something, and the little group of 11 people moved past all the buildings. As they walked, Lickler put her hand in Belle's, and the little boy did the same to Gus. They passed a few bushes and were in a clearing, but this area was different from any place they'd seen in the forest. In front of them, in an area about the size of a tennis court, was a garden, a Brazilian allotment, and full of vegetables growing in the morning sunshine. At one side of the garden, 2 women were loading baskets with a type of tuber. Belle watched with interest. It was brown on the outside, but the inside at each end was white. They were filling baskets right up, and Belle walked toward them to examine. Little Lickler said, "Open," and had Belle only been able to understand the toddler's language, she would have known that she was looking at yucca, cassava, manioc, or tapioca. Tapioca was the only way that she'd eaten it previously, but she was very interested in how it would be used. She pointed at the baskets, then at the women, and then to her mouth. The women laughed, and she was not sure if they understood her. If only she had the word for how. Gus was very interested. These people were not just hunter-gatherers, but farmers. It might be on a small scale, but they were cultivating the ground to some degree, and benefiting from their own grown produce. The more he saw of the Indian people, the more he liked their simple values, community spirit, and close unity with the forest around them. However, the older of the women took Belle a little further down the garden, and Belle, now carrying Lickler, was shown the plants growing. The plants were about 1 metre high, and the leaves reminded Belle of lupins because their leaves were similar in being finger-like and deep green. The old lady looked at Belle, pointed to the baskets, and then the plants, so it was the same plant. When all the women walked back to the village with Gus and Belle, they then gave them a demonstration of how they prepared the plant. First the tubers were skinned and then washed. After this it is ground down to a flaky powder or even into flour. Then the women brought bread, soup, a thick pudding-like substance, and also a plate of the vegetable just hot and steaming. She was taken into the house, and at the far end, over a fire, a young woman was watching over a large pot of apim boiling furiously. When the woman indicated with her arms long, Belle thought she meant boil for a long time, because though the apim is long when first taken from the ground, it's only the ground up stuff that is used to cook. Belle had assumed right. What she didn't know was that short boiling could lead to poisoning. Later, Belinda and Gus were given a plate of apim leaves that had been stewed with some meat. That was a tasty dish. Belle realised that this was a versatile and useful plant. She gathered from the women that the tubers had to be dried, grated or ground down, then boiled and strained. One woman who was straining out the flour thought that through a woven material indicated to her that the plant must be separated from the liquid. She pointed to a container that she had been using for the boiling process. She pointed to her mouth and then to her stomach and did a very good mime of a sick person. Belle got the message. The woman was an excellent communicator. The time came for Gus and Belle to go back home. They went to speak first to the elderly medicine man, and he gave a little speech which was lost on the visitors, except that it was obviously kindly meant, and Belle and Gus smiled in appreciation. The old man called to his son and yucked to fetch the bowl of ointment. He pointed to Belle but looked at Gus. He then made him spread his hand out and brought it down slowly, sinking below his outstretched other arm. Gus got the message. The prescription was rub liberal amounts into the patient's wound each night before she retires for the night. He took the old man's hand and shook it. Then, remembering where he was, he instead took his arms and nodded his head, grinning. The old man also held Gus's hands and grinned back. Belle also took the old man's hands, but she took one to her lips and kissed it. The old man seemed to appreciate that gesture. As they boarded a canoe with Rukno and another man, all the village came to see them off, and 3 women loaded baskets of apim aboard, obviously a gift to the white neighbours from the sky. Little Lipla came from her mother, Taliki, and held out a beautiful necklace of brightly painted wooden beads. Belle picked the cutest child she'd ever seen up once more and kissed her. She put her down on the riverbank and tied the necklace round her neck, to the delighted cries of all in the village. As they paddled away across and down the river, Belle and Gus waved until they were out of sight. "Why do you cry?" Belle asked. "Because they're such kind and lovely people." Gus smiled. He knew why Belle was crying, but he needed to hear her say it, so that he could explain the mixture of elation and sorrow beating away in his own chest. Belle was now experiencing strange and conflicting emotions and thoughts. She obviously wanted to be home in Salisbury because she missed her mother, her friends, and had her future to think about. A difficult future to plan without Gus, but despite her grief she was a positive girl, and she knew she had to press on with her life. Yet now, more than before, she knew that if she was back home in Salisbury, she would desperately want to see her new friends in this wild and beautiful Amazonian landscape. The terms nature, Native American, and Indians now meant something precious to her. Life could never be the same. Experiences in life may come by pure chance, for good and bad, but one thing is clear: these experiences will affect us, change us, and we can never be exactly as we were before we had them. That's the end of episode 22, my friends, and I look forward to sharing the next one. The story takes a different twist and turn from here on. It's nice to share it with you, and I really appreciate you reading it. Thanks ever so much. Hope you have a really good weekend, if it is the weekend for you when you watch this, and talk to you soon. Bye bye now. Bye.